Benyamin, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Scott, for having me. It's always a pleasure. I get a jacket? You know, like when you host a Saturday Night Live for like the 5th time, they give you a jacket. I think this might be my 3rd or 4th time on your show.
What you were going to get, we're going to mail to you from the Scott Jones production company. We're going to mail you a colored windscreen, and it will be seasonally appropriate. You'll see what we get for you. But you know what's crazy right now is we've just passed through Pesach, right? And
well, it's an 8-day holiday. We're in day
right
day 3, I think, right now.
But you're not having big seders right during the week.
No, seders are done. We did 2 seders.
The horseradish, the haggadah,
the horseradish, the matzah, I was going to say the apples dipped in honey, but that's a different holiday. The singing.
This is going to be a brutal Easter for the Christians because egg prices, they're just too expensive. You can't have Easter egg hunts. It's just too much. We're going to have to find maybe plastic eggs. I don't know what we're going to do in Christendom because it's just we got to make Easter great again, and I don't know that we can. I don't know that this is within the possibility of doing it. I mean, if Joe Biden had been president, they would have canceled Easter. Okay, look, if Biden had been president, Jesus never would have gotten out of the tomb. Okay, if Trump had been president, just 2 days in the tomb. Okay, we would have had Easter Saturday, and we love that. So I don't know.
When is Easter? This coming Sunday?
Is this coming Sunday. Yeah, Easter is this coming Sunday. So it's always great to have you on the show. For those of you in the audience who don't know your work, Benyamin is the news editor for The Forward, which is the oldest, right, Jewish independent newspaper in existence in the country, right? Is that the case?
Yeah, it's been around since 1897. Its birthday is actually next week, April 22nd. Is the anniversary of its first issue, which happens to also be my birthday. So it's kind of kismet that I work at a publication that shares my birthday.
I mean, there were banks back then, but there was no Hollywood. So what were the Jews doing with all their time?
This is back, this newspaper started in 1897 in the Lower East Side in Manhattan. It was catering mostly, to the Jewish immigrants who had come from Eastern Europe. It was a Yiddish newspaper when it first began. And interestingly enough, it wasn't like, I'm using air quotes here if your listeners can't see, but I mean, it wasn't really classically a Jewish newspaper in the sense that it was the only newspaper that these immigrants could read and understand because it was in their native tongue. And so it had all sorts of news. It had sports scores in it. It had, just any politics. It had just regular news in it because that's where most people were able to get their everyday news from. It really didn't even start, so to speak, as a quote unquote Jewish newspaper. It covered the sinking of the Titanic, whose anniversary was yesterday, actually.
How many Jews were on the Titanic? Do you know that?
Dozens of Jews died on the Titanic.
Dozens.
Including, was it Levi Strauss? There was a famous Jew who died or survived the Titanic. I forgot. I don't know it offhand. But yes, I remember the cover of The Forward was just lines of photos of people.
Do you feel like with your role as news editor to The Forward that you're put on the spot with questions like that more often? Like, hey, how many Jews are this? Or give me.
Yes. When I woke up this morning, I was not expecting someone to ask me how many Jews were on the manifest of the Titanic.
Hey, this is hard hitting conversation. We don't pull punches. Do you remember in Curb Your Enthusiasm when the funk man decides he can't play in the golf tournament because his rabbi said he can't play, and Larry's like, "You're Koufaxing us." It's fantastic. So, Benyamin, I I've read several times a piece you wrote, why Nazis spent World War II in a luxury West Virginia resort, the strange piece of forgotten history that tells the story of that you've written about, that tells the story of the Greenbrier Hotel, where German diplomats and their families, when the war broke out, when America America during America's involvement, not in the 30s necessarily, but in the 40s when America became involved. There was internment, and these German Nazis fared far better than the Japanese Americans. Even they didn't go to fenced in camps. They went to the Greenbrier Hotel, and you write about this strange period, and it wasn't an incredibly long period, but this strange period where these Nazis, these people who were involved deeply in the planning and communication about World War II with Hitler, with the inner circle, we put these people up on the at the cost of about, in today's dollars, 200 bones, $200 a day.
Yeah.
A lovely life. Why did you want to write about this? Why of all the things you could write about in the top Jewish daily newspaper website in the country, why did you take some time to write about this legacy, the story of the Nazis in the Greenbrier Hotel?
Well, my beat, I mean, I write about, I write about all sorts of topics. Right before I hopped on this podcast, I was just writing about the Jewish president of Harvard University and all that's happening today with the Trump administration. So I write, I cover a lot of different topics. My favorite beat is off the beaten path stories, quirky stories. Last week, I wrote a story about an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory involving kosher for Passover Coca-Cola. And so, yeah,
you have to. You can't. What's going on with that? You can't just put that. That's a big matzo ball, so to speak, to leave hanging out there.
I can't just dangle that and walk away. So that actually, if anyone's interested, they can go to forward.com to read it. But basically, the upshot of that is kosher for Passover Coca-Cola. The recipe is slightly different. Regular all year round Coca-Cola has corn syrup in it. High fructose corn syrup, which is, as we all know, pretty unhealthy. RFK Jr. will tell you that. And for Passover, we can't, most what they call Ashkenazi Jews of Eastern European descent, have a tradition of not eating corn on Passover. And so a lot of rabbis say that means you can't have Coca-Cola on Passover because it's got high fructose corn syrup. So what Coca-Cola does once a year is they make a special batch of kosher for Passover soda, all around the world, actually, not just in America, where they substitute high fructose corn syrup with cane sugar. And
that sounds fabulous. That sounds great.
Well, you can actually get this if you want. If a lot of grocery stores, if you go to their international aisle, have what people refer to often as Mexican Coke, because Mexican Coke is also similarly uses sugar instead of high fructose corn syrup.
Is it brought over by the bad hombres, the rapists, the murderers? They bring the Mexican Coke. Okay, is it bad?
It's actually made. It's actually made. Well, the kosher for Passover Coke that's sold in the U.S., the concentrate is actually made in Puerto Rico, which I would assume means it's exempt from tariffs because it's part of the U.S. But the conspiracy theory, and then we'll get back to the Nazis, which I'm sure people want to hear about. The conspiracy theory about the kosher for Passover Coke is that the soda giant made a healthier version of Coca-Cola for Jews, because it has sugar instead of high fructose corn syrup. And so that was the conspiracy theory, that Coca-Cola was making a special, quote unquote, superior version of its product for Jews only. It's obviously not true because anyone can buy this Coke. You don't need to show your Jew card when you go to the grocery store to buy kosher for Passover Coke. So anyone can buy it. But anyway, which is all to say, I enjoy writing about offbeat topics, quirky topics, bizarre stories you may not see in other places. And so when I heard about this Nazi story, it intrigued me because it was a piece of American history I had never heard about. And more importantly, for me, I am one of the few Jews who live in West Virginia. And so when someone told me about when I heard about this story about Nazis in West Virginia, it really particularly intrigued me. So
what is it? What is the Jewish population in West Virginia percentage wise?
First, you're asking me about the Jewish manifest, the Jewish population of the Titanic, and now you're asking me the Jewish population of West Virginia. I'm not sure, but it's extremely small is what I can say. I like to joke around that when I leave my town in West Virginia, um, the Jewish population is cut in half. Although that's not true, but that's what I like to say.
No, you do say you drive a pickup truck, but you've told me you drive
I
it
drive it ironically. Yeah, I drive it. Yeah. So I think it's important to understand what this resort was and is. So this resort, it's called the Greenbrier Resort. It's a lush, high-end mountain resort in the mountains of Appalachia. It's on 11,000 acres, and it was created over 100 years ago, and it is still around today. It's still an operational luxury resort that people go to today. Tom Cruise actually has a property on the resort. It's a great skiing location. People go. They have a lot of golf tournaments there. President Trump has golfed there a bunch of times. And so this resort, picture yourself before World War II. This resort hosted, the top of the top. The politicians stayed there. Every president, not every president, but presidents going back as far as Martin Van Buren have stayed there. President Clinton has stayed there. President Bush has stayed there. President Trump has been there. A lot of presidents go to this resort. Captains of industry stayed there. John D. Rockefeller used to go vacation there. Members of Congress used to go vacation there. Actors and celebrities vacation there. So in the early 1900s, Bob Hope, Debbie Reynolds, Princess Grace, royalty, everybody came to this beautiful resort called the Greenbrier. And then what happened was, when Pearl Harbor happened in December 1941, and the Japanese attacked the U.S. at Pearl Harbor, the United States was forced with a question. Okay, we're at war now. Like, they were kind of forced really overnight into being an active participant in World War II. And in America at the time, there were hundreds of German and Japanese and Italian diplomats who lived in the United States. They worked in the embassy in DC. They worked in different consulates across the country. And then add to that their families, their wives, their kids, and you're talking about a few thousand people from these countries were living in the United States, and we had just went to war with them, the Germans, Japanese, and Italians. And so the question was, what do we do with these diplomats and their families?
And there's a corresponding reality in places like Germany and Italy. I don't know about Japan. I'm sure maybe that's the case there too. We had American diplomats and their families, right, in these countries.
Right. So there's this problem happening on both sides of the globe, and we don't want to. The U.S. government does not want to put these diplomats in prison because they want reciprocity. They want to treat these diplomats and their families with dignity, with the hopes that Germany and Japan would do the same with American diplomats who were stuck overseas. So that was the issue at hand. And so they needed to find a place very quick. We often think that government moves at a turtle's pace, at a glacial pace. So Pearl Harbor happened on December 7th, and 12 days later, the United States had already figured out what we're going to do with these diplomats. So it only took like 2 weeks for them to figure out what to do with these diplomats and get them moving.
This is remarkable. This is the kind of story that Ezra Klein loves, right?
Why is that?
A government being imaginative with its resources and acting quickly and not, this is not like the story of rural broadband, right? Where you spend all that, where it's something that we know everybody needs, right? Yeah. And we just can't get it, right? We just can't do it, right? I mean, we're all these applications you have to do, it takes years to get this money to get the rural broadband. This is amazing that in 11 days or this is Josh Shapiro, or 12 days. This is Josh. This is in the time it takes to sit the 12 days of Christmas, right? By the time you're the partridge is in the pear tree, this thing is done. It's remarkable. This is like Josh Shapiro fixing I-95. It seems to me to be a very imaginative and urgent use of resources. Now, how do they figure? All right, where are we going to put him? Let's put the Nazis in the luxury resort.
Well, they needed a place, that can handle this. So they actually picked 3 resorts, one in West Virginia, one in Virginia, and one in Asheville, North Carolina. They picked 3 resorts, and they needed a place. The nice thing about these resorts was that it was winter time, and they were mostly empty because nowadays these resorts are open 365 all year. But back in those days, winter was the down season for them, and so they were not crowded. So that was great. And they assumed that they would not be staying, that long, relatively speaking. So they figured this would be a good temporary solution. And the government already had, the politicians already were very familiar with the Greenbrier because, first of all, it's like 200 miles west of D.C. And it was a very common vacation spot for politicians in D.C. So they already knew they vacationed there. And they knew the owners, they knew the people the general manager, they knew all the people who ran the place. So it was an easy phone call to make. The other nice thing about the Greenbrier was that the train stopped on the property of the Greenbrier. The Greenbrier is located on a train stop. So it was very easy to send detainees there because you just put them on a train and you wouldn't have to deal with transferring them from a train stop to the resort. The train literally stopped on the resort property. So that was another reason they chose the Greenbrier. And the Greenbrier looked at it as, you have to remember, back in those days, people were trying to help the U.S. and be patriotic and help with the war effort. That was kind of like the theme of the day. And so the Greenbrier looked at this as their patriotic duty and opportunity to help the country in its time of need. So the Greenbrier, jumped at the opportunity, and also they were going to, not lose money in the sense that the government was going to be paying them. It was $10 a day in 1941 money for the detainees, and they eventually filled up the entire hotel with over 1,000. I think it was like 1,200 people, diplomats and their wives and their kids. They even there was at least 12 dogs. Some pets were there. There were some birds, they brought everything with them to the Greenbrier. And also a lot of government officials came to monitor the whole situation. So not only were there like 1,200 detainees, but there were like a couple hundred members of the FBI and the State Department who basically lived there to watch over the whole operation.
And they've got to figure maybe they catch some intelligence, right? Maybe you bug some things, or maybe you send a busboy that's really an FBI agent to wait on the Nazis as they're maybe passing secrets, right? I mean, you've really made, in some sense, a domestic, what do they call it? Honeypot or whatever, honey trap or whatever, honey trap, whatever. Yeah. The domestic honey. I mean, you've made some sort of place where you could actually gather intelligence all in one space.
Yeah, that was actually like kind of just like an added, gravy on top of the whole situation. Was that so? Basically, these German diplomats and their families, and eventually some Japanese diplomats moved in. There were some Italian diplomats who did not get along with the German diplomats, so they were sent to the North Carolina resort.
Well, why did they not get? What was the beef with the Italians and the Germans?
Well, a lot of the Italians didn't like Hitler, and so I just think there was a power struggle between the Italians and the Germans. But to answer your question about about tapping and listening in and getting intelligence, it was an intelligence operation. So all of the phones were tapped. So there was a large, it was a large contingency of FBI operatives who were listening in on all the phone calls. So that when the diplomats knew they were being recorded, but you never know when they might slip up. More importantly, these diplomats basically picture this. They're living at this resort, okay, during World War II, while Germany is at war and, they're struggling in a war zone. These diplomats are living in the West Virginia mountains, with a spa and a pool and golf and ping pong, and there was an Olympic roller skating rink. There was an Olympic swimmer who taught swimming lessons. There was a musician. Every night they had a fancy, they get dressed up in suit and tie, and in the ballroom they'd have a fancy, 5-course meal with waiters. They were living as normal guests at this resort. The hotel treated them as if they were normal guests. But so everybody who worked at the hotel would always be listening to see if they could pick up some intelligence. So you may have some German Nazis hanging out at the bar after dinner, and after a few drinks, they get a little loose-lipped, and they might, let something slip. And so the bartender was taking notes for J. Edgar Hoover and would report back, anything you heard. The masseuses, I told you there's a spa. The Greenbrier Resort is located in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, which is known for its healing waters. And so a lot of people go, even to this day, people go to the Greenbrier for the spa treatments there. And so when these Nazis would get their spa treatments and they'd be loosened by the massages and relaxed, they would often let secrets slip to the masseuses. And the masseuses would report back to the State Department and the FBI things that they learned as well. They were also... there wasn't a lot of mail let in or let out, but the mail that was let in and out, the government was screening. Interestingly enough, the government banned any periodicals or magazines, which really annoyed the people there because they were a little bored during the day. But they did let in the New York Times every day. So they were getting the New York Times every day. Also, every night, they had a theater at the Greenbrier, and they showed movies every night, like Gone with the Wind and just different movies to keep people entertained. They set up schools for the kids because they ended up being there at the Greenbrier for about 7 months until about June 1942, when the Greenbrier was ready to open up again and have regular customers. And by that point, America and Germany and Japan had organized a swap of the diplomats from each side of the globe. Anyway, the kids were at school basically for 7 months. They were in the resort. They set up schools for the kids. Yeah.
Now, at this point, right? I mean, in the beginning of the war, people were not widely aware of the Holocaust, right? I mean, there were people that obviously knew, but there were people that didn't know what was going on, right? With the extermination of Jews and the degree to which Jews and others were being exterminated in death camps and things like this. What's the attitude? I mean, you talk about in the piece a Jewish musician who's playing to entertain these folks, right? And yeah. I mean, what's the relationship like with the staff or with this Jewish musician? I mean, how do they feel entertaining Nazis? Like they're just they're waiting hand and foot in a pretty bougie scenario on not just an enemy, but an enemy that now we think of the Nazi, we think of this as the quintessential embodiment of human evil.
Right. I like the way you put that. First of all, let's state the facts. There were not a lot of Jews in West Virginia. And at the resort, there was only, maybe at most a handful of Jews who worked at the resort while the Nazis were there. I write in the article about one in particular. His name was Nathan Portnoff. He was the organist that the Greenbrier hired, and he would play his piano in the lobby. And a lot of the kids would love hanging around him, and he would actually teach them pro-American songs. There is a book I'd recommend. There's a work of historical fiction. For those of you who are watching on the live cast right now, it's called In the Shadow of the Greenbrier. And it's a work of historical fiction about the Nazis' 7-month stay at the Greenbrier. And it is about the Jewish workers at the Greenbrier and how they reacted to it. So it's, like I said, it's a work of historical fiction, but it's based in this story. Now, how did the staff in general feel about the Nazis who were staying there? Like I said, they were all looking at this as very a patriotic thing to do at the time, that they were able to help the country fight the war. A couple things they didn't like. they weren't the diplomats were not allowed to tip the waiters and the hotel staff. And so the hotel staff was very upset because normally when guests were there, they would get tips. And so after the staff complained, the State Department put aside some money each week to just divvy up as tips. So the State Department paid the tips.
Do you think they would have let Elon Musk would let this stand? This right, would be part of the waste fraud. Right. Doge would do away with this right away.
The other thing was there were some German waiters there. I think there was about a dozen German waiters who were found out to kind of be like slipping messages and helping the diplomats, and those German waiters were fired. So there were some, people there who affiliated with the Nazis, but they eventually were rooted out. Reporters, the whole thing was closed off to the public. Reporters tried to climb the fence and get in. There was one reporter who dressed up. No joke. He dressed up as Santa Claus because this happened over Christmas. Was when they first arrived. He dressed up as Santa Claus, then knocked at the door, hoping he could get in. As Santa Claus.
This is. I mean, it's no shock that there's a historical fiction, a novel that's fictionalized this, right? I mean. This seems like a screenplay waiting to be written, right? I mean, I would watch this movie, right? I mean, you could have romances, you could have kind of stooge-like characters, you could have all manner of interesting plot devices and twists, right? Just from the nature of the story.
Yeah, and it's got a great, it's got a great narrative arc. There's a beginning and a middle and end. It's a 7-month thing. Pearl Harbor, then they moved to the Greenbrier. They stayed at the Greenbrier through winter and spring, and then they went back on this ship, eventually back to Germany. Again, picture, like you said, it's so visual. They're living in the lap of luxury. There were cocktail parties, luncheons, teas.
I've never been to the Greenbrier. I've never vacationed like this ever in my life, and I'm not a Nazi.
Yeah.
Look, Elon Musk is talking about the Doge payments, okay, and the $6,000 or whatever. I'd like a Doge trip, okay. I've never been a Nazi. I'm loyal to the country. Elon, if you're listening, send me to the Greenbrier.
But so I went to the Greenbrier for the reporting on this trip. One of the
Did you spend the night?
No, I didn't spend the night because. Yeah, I didn't. It's expensive to stay there. I did not spend the night.
There's a man like you, a newsman like you, doesn't have a little slush fund that you can spend the night.
I just finished reading the memoir of. I literally just yesterday finished reading the memoir of Graydon Carter, who was the editor of Vanity Fair magazine for like a quarter of a century, the last 25, 30 years, and he writes about like in the 1990s, like the heyday of magazines when they're like going on private jets to fashion shoots and all these things in Paris. No, I actually stayed at a much cheaper hotel nearby. When I went there.
Like the Motel 6, Days Inn.
I think it was a Holiday Inn Express.
Did you get the free breakfast? You get the hot breakfast?
I only stay at places that offer free continental breakfast. But so I went to the Greenbrier because I said it's still an operational luxury resort today. It's kind of like walking into Graceland a little bit. Like, it's a dated facility. It's like just the opulence is kind of like over the top there. But it's definitely for the moneyed set. There's a certain type of person I think that likes to vacation there. But I went there and they have tours. You can take tours of the facility. And so I went on a tour. I went on 2 different tours actually. And it's cool. You can actually get a cocktail and sip a cocktail in the same ballroom where these Nazis on April 20th, 1942 celebrated Hitler's birthday with a big dinner in the ballroom.
Is this a place? Is it a big draw for anti-Semites? You think, and then white nationalists? Yeah, why don't we go like, hey, you imagine a group of white nationalists? Hey, Earl, it's your birthday. What do you want to do? Well, I'd love it if we could go to the Greenbrier and sip cocktails and tell anti-Semitic jokes and then toast Hitler's birthday. I mean, what don't you think it'd be kind of on the map for for anti-Semites and white nationalists?
It's possible. Yeah. I mean, I don't think, first of all, I don't think a lot of people know about this. It is, like I said, it is expensive to get in there. So, yeah, they have to be rich anti-Semites.
That's a stereotype that white nationalists don't have money for. Yeah.
The hotel, by the way, nowadays is owned. It's for the last, I think, almost 20 years has been owned by one of the richest men in West Virginia, Jim Justice, who was the governor of West Virginia and now is a senator from West Virginia. He's one of the wealthiest landowners in the state, and he owns the Greenbrier. I'll be honest with you, the Greenbrier has seen better days. I mean, you could probably stay at it's opulent in the way, like maybe like, like some Trump resorts might be a little, gold inflected and all that kind of stuff. There's probably nicer hotels you can stay at, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. I came across a quote today from Jack Kerouac's journals, and the quote I found really moving. I've read it several times today. Nothing else in the world matters but the kindness of grace, God's gift to suffering mortals. And I was thinking about that as I was reading. I came across that in a book I'm reading for a conversation I'm going to have tomorrow. I mean, I was thinking of just how bereft our society can be of grace, right? Of mercy, of extravagant. This is an extravagant display of grace in some ways. Now, of course, there may be some strategic, pragmatic ends to it, right? I mean, it might be an intelligence gathering spot. It might be self-interested. So, hey, if we treat their diplomats well, maybe there'll be reciprocal treatment of our diplomats and things like that. You could come up with things that flesh out the realpolitik dimension of this. But still, even still, I can't help but think, as a student of theology, this is like a parable of Jesus or something, right? Where Jesus sits down with a bunch of people and says, let me tell you a story about the time that the State Department entertained a bunch of Nazis, right? You imagine there's some punchline about how to treat your enemies or how to deal with those you find repugnant, right? And for a culture that, is there a lesson here in this piece you wrote, in this history you lift up? Is there a lesson for the culture of repugnancy, right? I mean, we're all, we're in a tribalized society where people are really find their political opponents. They have a tough time believing they're people of goodwill, people of good faith. I mean, they're not just opponents, they're enemies. Is there a lesson here? If we could treat Nazis with this kind of extravagant grace, how could we treat people across the political and cultural divide? When you were writing this, were you thinking of lessons that could be learned for our own cultural moment?
Yeah, I mean, I was writing this, the article is only a few weeks old. I was writing it, while everything that's going on in the news right now, we see, all these, immigrants being sent to Venezuela or El Salvador, and they're being, these videos that are coming out of Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem in front of cages, of shirtless men. And you think about, I mean, obviously you can't compare the situation in 2025 to the situation in 1941, but there's still just the visuals, to me, is pretty stark, that you see how they treated these Nazis with dignity. Now, again, these were, I don't know what you call them, non-enemy, non-combatants. These were diplomats who were already in the States, but they treated them with dignity. They treated them, as you say, with grace. I think they bent over backwards to make them comfortable. There were actually these when they were living at the hotel, they filled out like comment cards and complained about different things at the hotel. And it was all, people who work in the hospitality industry, like, they're there, they want to make people stay the best day possible. And so it's that service mentality. But it's just, you see it here to the extreme. But I think, how we treat our enemies in a time of war, allowing our enemies to be human. I think there are lessons, certainly we can learn from that.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I just, in the cultural moment right now, Bill Maher went to the White House and had dinner. Donald Trump invited him, I think, as a result of a conversation with Kid Rock. And Kid Rock is friendly both with Bill Maher and Donald Trump. He said, you guys should just sit down and talk. And Bill Maher did it. It's very funny because he had his staff print out a list of all the insults that Trump have ever said about. He's a creep. He's a lowlife. He's a filthy guy. And he took the printout and had Trump sign it. but it sounded like they had a really interesting conversation that Bill Maher kind of gave a little. He's like, I'm going to give my book report on the interaction. But a lot of people think he shouldn't have done that. That it was normalizing Trump, or that it was. Or that he was being used as a prop, and they immediately compared it to famous fascists, and how these guys could all be charming and entertaining and use people as window dressing and as legitimizing forces. And I just think of that. I think of that where you write about this piece where in another part of the century we could see fit to be gracious to our enemies, right? To Hitler's diplomats and ambassadors and things. And now we can't see fit to think it might be a good thing for an entertainer and a president to sit and have a casual dinner.
Right. Not with an enemy, just with
an enemy.
Might disagree with politically. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I just wonder what could we do something like this at the Greenbrier today? I mean, is this sort of grace and decency even possible?
I mean, not what I'm reading in the headlines that nowadays. I mean, you see, we're sending people, we're deporting people and rounding people up. So I definitely don't think that would happen today. The interesting thing about the Greenbrier, it has a weird history of serving the country. There's like 3 stories in history, 3 episodes in 3 chapters in history where the Greenbrier served the country. So this was the first chapter, this Nazi detainment. And then after World War II, the U.S. government took over the hotel and turned it into a military hospital for returning soldiers, wounded soldiers, veterans who needed medical care. And so the ballroom where these Nazis dined every night in tuxedos was turned into a surgery and triage center for these soldiers returning home from war. So, the Greenbrier was turned into that. Again, they looked at it as their patriotic duty. And then to me, the most fascinating thing, I mean, people may think the Nazis chapter is the most fascinating, but to me, the most fascinating thing is in 1962, the government, Congress specifically, was looking to build a doomsday bunker for members of Congress in the event of the apocalypse. So this was, right around the time,
Are we talking a nuclear apocalypse? The zombie right apocalypse? Jesus right coming back?
Right, the resurrection. Right around the time
general apocalyptic terror.
No, it was around the nuclear, the Red Scare, the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was right around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, right before the Cuban Missile Crisis. They were worried about nuclear attack from Russia. And so Congress wanted to build an underground shelter for members of Congress. And they wanted it to be close enough to DC that they could get there quickly in the event of attack, but not too close that it would be enveloped in a DC attack. So the Greenbrier, again, 200 miles west of DC, was a perfect look, and on a railroad line, was the perfect location. So in 1962, the U.S. government built an underground bunker at the Greenbrier to hold all members of Congress and their staff. And they had it was the size of several football fields underground with 18-ton, walls built around it so that you could live down there. And it had like 9 months worth of food. They had a cafeteria. They had rooms for bunks. They actually they built 2 auditoriums down there so that the Senate and the Congress could meet and resume the functions of government in these 2 auditoriums underground. And this underground bunker under the Greenbrier, like I said, was built in the early 1960s. It was there and always ready for someone to come and stay there until 1992, when a Washington Post reporter found out about it and wrote a big expose about it and revealed it to the world. And so in the early
Benyamin,
90s,
it's you people, it's you reporters, you journalists. This is why we can't have nice things. This is why we can't have nice things, my friend. This is why we can't have secret bunkers and opulent resorts. It's because somebody's got to leak it.
Well, the funny thing is, so they kept it frozen in time. And you can actually, when I went to visit the Greenbrier last month, they give tours of the underground bunker for like $45. You can go on a tour of and it's still basically the same. And you could see these 2 auditoriums and the cafeteria. And it's pretty wild. So they use it now as like a tourist attraction, but you can see it.
But yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating story, and I'll link to it in the show notes. I hope all of our listeners engage this, because it's a wonderful, interesting piece of history. Again, with I think some lessons for a polarized cultural moment. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, as a leading Jewish journalist. There's so much going on right now with the Trump administration, and attempting to fight anti-Semitism. In the name of that, restricting funding and kind of coming down on universities. And this is not the carrot, it's the rod here. I'm wondering what you're involved in national Jewish conversations and involved in personal ones. What kind of communication are you hearing about the Trump administration's efforts regarding anti-Semitism, and how and good idea, bad idea? Is it being well received? Do we like it? Can we dance to it?
On one foot, can you answer this question?
Yeah, exactly.
Could be a whole other separate episode. I think there's a tension. Obviously, there are people who believe, believe there's issues regarding anti-Semitism on campus, and they feel like what Trump is doing, with tamping down on student protests and revoking visas of international students who have attended pro-Palestinian protests. Some people believe that that's, a good thing. And there are people who believe, that that's a step too far. You're stepping, one of the things about America is we have the freedom to protest and the freedom of speech, etc. A lot of the people I think I've spoken with, and for example, I just published a story this morning. You can check it out at forward.com. A little plug. I interviewed former Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt, who was President Biden's anti-Semitism envoy. And I asked her about this same question you just asked me. And she said, I was a little bit surprised she said this to me. She's like, I actually agree with some of what President Trump is doing. I just wish he would do it more deftly, is the word she used. And also that all the laws are followed. It's one thing to find a student who, broke the law and broke the law and punish them. It's another thing to just do widespread sweeps of students because you disagree with them. And so she was just saying, like, conceptually, I agree with some of this, but this needs to be done. We're a nation of laws, is what she said. So I think that's what I see is it's so easy nowadays in today's political environment to think of everything as binary. Anti-Trump, pro-Trump, pro-Palestinian, pro-Israel. But I think reality is so much more gray. I interviewed a few weeks ago a Jewish student at Columbia University, also about this topic. She's been to many of the pro-Israel rallies at her campus. And I said, are you happy that Trump's getting involved? And she's like, yeah, I'm happy, but I wish he didn't have to. And she was like, it's not like she was saying, like, she agrees with some of the protesters and she agrees with, like, she was just saying, I just wish people realized it was much more gray and nuanced is the word she used. And too often I think people look at the news as black and white instead of gray.
Do you think that this is the most anti-Semitic moment of your lifetime? No. Have you seen
in my lifetime?
In your lifetime, yeah, isn't it? Not, of course, in the history of the country, but I mean, in your lifetime, do you remember
in the United States?
In the United States, and as long as you've been alive, where do you rate the cultural moment? Is it about average? Is it higher, lower?
I don't know if I could answer that. I mean, I've never lived in a major Jewish city. Like, I've never lived in like New York or Los Angeles, and so I don't know what the lived experience of a Hasidic guy on the New York subway is. You know, if he's getting punched, you know, when he walks on the subway, or, you know, I can't really speak to that. You know, I'm kind of living in a different. I live off to the side, and so
you've got your pickup truck, you've got your chickens, you're in your own private Idaho.
Well, my lived experience is different, I think, than many other Jews in America.
Benyamin, I'm glad that you're writing. I'm glad that you're telling stories. You're a great storyteller, a great journalist. I really appreciate this work you did on the Greenbrier. Thanks for writing it, and thanks for coming on the podcast and talking with me about it.
Thanks for having me. Next time I come on, I'm expecting a letter jacket for the podcast.
It's happening. Thanks, Benyamin.
Take care, Scott.